All right, so the last speaker of the morning session is Elizabeth Cantalamessa from University of Miami, who is going to give a talk with the following title: The Post-Truth Authorities, Anti-Authoritarianism and the Space of Reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm over on the East Coast, so it's 6:30 in the morning, so good morning, but good afternoon to you all. Happy to be here. I know my topic is slightly different than what we've been talking about in the conference, but I'm hoping that you all find it still interesting and fruitful for your work as well on reasons more specifically. Although Rorty's in the title, he's not going to really play into anything until the end, because I unfortunately won't have enough time to get to everything I'd like to, but we will. Oops, let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. So Wittgenstein once said that the problems arising through misinterpretation of our forms of language have the character of depth. They are deep disquietudes. Their roots are deep as in our forms of language, and their significance is as great as the importance of our language. Let us ask ourselves, why do we feel that a grammatical joke to be deep? And what is the depth of philosophy? And that is what the depth of philosophy is. And further, Wittgenstein has said that the grammar reveals to us the essence of something, right? So grammar tells us what kind of thing, what kind of object anything is. I mean, he makes a sort of strange remark about theology as grammar. You know, for Wittgenstein, many philosophical problems and purportedly metaphysical problems and questions arise due to misunderstanding or misuses of language, right? And so we can consider the metaphysical puzzles associated with the statue and the clay, right? This is a long-standing, enduring philosophical problem that seems to be related in some sense to grammar, right? In the way that Wittgenstein talks about it. So Lynn Baker, when she proposes a theory of the relationship between a pile or a lump of copper and the statue that it is formed into. She claims that the copper does not become a statue, but it constitutes one. So there's this appeal to different grammatical forms that are taken to, you know, tell us something about the nature of what it is to be a statue, or persistence or essence or something like that. Hopefully this will play. And then we have grammatical jokes like that of Mitch Hedberg.
I like an escalator, man, because the escalator can never break. It can only become stairs. There would never be an escalator temporarily out of order sign. Only an escalator temporarily stairs.
So there I take it that Mitch Hedberg's joke, right, plays on grammar. So it's the type of grammatical joke that I believe Wittgenstein's talking about when he makes certain remarks in the philosophical investigation specifically regarding jokes. He also famously says that a serious and good work of philosophy could be written entirely of jokes. And maybe you can think of what I'm trying to do here. My project is really exploring that, what that could involve and how our practices of humor might be doing something continuous with philosophy. Okay, so here's my plan. Broadly speaking, I'm going to explore how bringing humor and inferentialism together illuminates aspects of each separately. So first I'll talk about first I'll introduce broadly what philosophers talk about when they talk about humor. And then I'll show how the Inferentialist is particularly well suited to capture many of the important social and normative features of humor that philosophers and scientists care about when they theorize and look into humor. And Inferentialism provides us with a pluralist methodology for approaching first order questions regarding like the permissibility of jokes. So that's also, you know, a significant or popular topic when looking into humor, philosophy of humor, and the ethics of humor. And I think inferentialism gives us a deflationist and pluralist methodology that's particularly useful for people to explore these questions without bringing further metaphysical and semantic puzzles in doing so. And then in the third section, I want to show how from even within the inferentialist framework, humor should be understood maybe as a meta vocabulary, akin to what some philosophers have suggested about like metaphysical modal discourse, like Brandom and Amy Thomason. And then I conclude by drawing on Richard Rorty's notion of pragmatism as anti-authoritarianism, to suggest that humor can be a particularly efficient way for us to challenge, reveal norms that isn't reducible to reason-based explanation. So it might be the case that humor is particularly powerful as an expressive tool in cases where we cannot challenge norms in a straightforward manner, like with assertions. Okay. So, right, humor is a huge topic. There's lots of things that could fall under the term humor. And so first off, when I'm talking about humor, what am I even talking about to begin with? And there's ways in which it's approached in the literature, philosophical literature, and the empirical literature, which I think similarly generates problems akin to what we would expect with representationalism. So I think a lot of Brandom's inferentialist work has shown is, representationalist assumptions like tend to produce particular metaphysical and epistemic problems and puzzles. And given the audience for this talk, I assume most of us are aware, or at least, aware of that, or some of those problems. And that's just to say you find it as well in the literature on humor. But what I mean when I talk about humor for this purposes is going to be particularly, I'm going to focus on linguistic jokes and linguistic humor, but I'm not assuming or trying to purport that that's what like true or genuine humor is. I want to try to explore it in as much a diverse way as possible. But when philosophers approach it, right, one of the questions is, what are we doing when we tell jokes? Why do we have social practices of joke telling, and why have they persisted throughout different cultures and times? So there's been a lot of work in cultural studies and history and anthropology on the social role of the jester or the clown, which isn't unique to European cultures. It's also found in China, in Native America, and also South America. So there's a sense in which humor has this cross-cultural and historical persistence and prevalence, and it exhibits a sort of cross-cultural. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. But anyway, it has things that are sort of universally found throughout time and throughout different cultures. But when philosophers and scientists approach theorizing about humor, they assume that it's something like a natural kind, and they aim to give a grand unified theory that can capture all the different ways we've used humor or we laugh. And in doing so, they end up overcommitting themselves and leading to various problems and puzzles. So I'll just stop there. So there are like classical theories of humor, just to give you a broad overview of the field or of the philosophical theories. There can be categorized in three main ways. One is superiority theory, which is technically the oldest theory of humor, and it dates back to Plato. It's also endorsed by people like Thomas Hobbes, where humor is the appreciation of one's social superiority. So it's associated with mocking laughter. So laughing at someone, it's taken to originate in the Western tradition in Homer, where the gods are laughing at another god who has been disfigured and disabled. So there's a historical trajectory that associates laughter with recognizing and appreciating one's superior social status. So maybe you can already see there's an intimate connection between humor, the normative dimensions of humor, and social status. And most conventional theories are not well equipped to acknowledge or handle, social status or the role that social status plays. Another important theory dating to or attributed largely to Freud is humor as a coping mechanism, whereby like aggressive or mocking laughter serves this role of enabling us to express taboo or repressed attitudes. Or certain like cognitive dissonance that comes from having to, censor ourselves or in some sense control what we do. that one, so both superiority theory and coping mechanism, they don't have a deep distinction between the two, and depending on the social status of the jokester, so to speak, the function of an insult seems to be different. It could be superiority theory if the jokester is themselves occupies a superior social status or position, but then it seems to be explained as a coping mechanism when the jokester is occupies like a marginalized or inferior, socially inferior position or role. And so that's part of the problem with these theories is they have trouble capturing, they purport to give us the essence of humor, but then they can't actually account for every case of humor, particularly a superiority theory and coping mechanism, because it's not clear or obvious that every case of laughter is due to feelings of superiority, or is itself related in some sense to repressed attitudes. Part of what I'm trying to show is a lot of humor is just playfulness, which need not have this background sort of psychological story going on. But perhaps the most powerful, like explanatorily powerful theory is incongruity theory, which is attributed to Kant, which defines humor, funniness as the delight in the unexpected clash of expectations, a violation of norms, or juxtaposition between the serious and the ridiculous. So it's sort of more of a cognitive theory. And this one incongruity theory seems to be most promising because it can subsume the other theories. So what we're doing when we're feeling superior to others is feeling superior with regard to their incongruities, right? So, and similarly with coping mechanism, it could be in some sense having to repress responses associated with recognizing incongruities. So that's just to say incongruity theory can subsume the other two. So it's already more powerful, explanatorily powerful. However, not every incongruity is funny. So we still need some way to specify what makes particular incongruities funny. And on this end, incongruity theory has also had a lot of uptake in empirical and developmental studies in humor, like the evolutionary function, role, and origins of humor. And not a lot of work. Humor is basically under-theorized in like every domain, including empirical and philosophical. However, there is some important studies, or there have been some important studies done that support this view, going back to people like Aristotle, who have proposed that humor is distinctly human. And so empirical work suggests that humor is distinctly human in the sense that it is innate, universal to us qua humans, and it's potentially based in computational processes in the brain related to the recognition and processing of incongruities or error. And psychological studies have shown or support the claim that a child's sense of humor is related or shaped by their social environment, particularly the attitudes of those around them. So there was a recent book, I guess like 10 years ago, proposing an evolutionary theory of humor, which argued that humor should be understood as a mechanism for cognitive debugging, basically a way for us to recognize errors through incongruities, but appreciate the recognition of those errors. So that mitigates any cognitive costs or psychological costs that might be associated with recognizing the error. So the idea is it was particularly helpful for us and our ancestors to appreciate recognizing errors, particularly errors that might have to do with our social norms, or incongruity in the commitments that we have undertaken through internalizing certain social norms. And it's pretty obvious, I think it's crucial for us to acknowledge incongruities and errors as a method of survival. And in terms of sort of how we want to understand humor evolutionary or developmentally, it might also be related to capacities for play, which then would tie into other non-human animals. Although I'm just trying to focus more on the rational side of the rational animal, akin, in line with inferentialism more broadly. That's all to say, each theory seems to get something right, but there has yet to be a theory that captures everything in a sort of uncontested way, right? So even the Hurley evolutionary theory has received a lot of criticism because it in part defines or identifies humor with this function of cognitive debugging. And so that's part of sort of my end of the first section, is showing how a lot of the existing philosophical theories of humor go wrong because they assume that in giving a functional account of humor, what you're doing is giving the essence of it, what humor really is, such that we can now take that theory and use it to pick out all the true or correct instances of humor or laughter. And you can see this if you look into the literature and people who have written or responded to some of the evolutionary theories of humor. So there's a debate about whether humor should be understood as this recognition of incongruity, or if it should be understood as like a particularly useful tool for sexual selection. And the way I see it is we don't need to figure that out in order to be able to explore the important philosophical questions we might want to about humor. And in part, what theorists have been doing is overcommitting themselves in assuming that in giving a theory of humor, we have to give like the essence of what it is. So I think that follows from sort of methodological commitments related to like scientific methodology and realism. Again, I just won't have enough time to really talk about all that here, but just the idea being drawing from Amy Thomason's lightweight approach to philosophy, which is broadly inferentialist in spirit. She says that we go wrong in assuming that a functional count aims to give basically an identity statement between the function and the target thing to be explained. So in her case, she talks about metaphysical modal discourse, but the idea being expressivism goes wrong when we say, you know, the function of language or a term is to express attitudes, because then you have a very narrow set of accepted uses that fit that function, when in reality we can think of function more like artifactual function, where, you know, the function of a stapler is to staple paper together, but given its properties, you know, it has a particular weight, a particular shape in order to fulfill that function, and because of that we can use it in other ways. So Thomason draws this distinction between function and use. So instead of saying, you know, the function is X and that's an identity statement, we can say, well, the function of humor might be recognizing incongruities. However, we still use it in other ways, such as to insult people or to, you know, express joy or for no reason at all. Right. So that's just to say, I think part of the problem in existing literature is this overcommitment, sort of a heavyweight or a metaphysical reading of function. Instead, I just want to say tentatively, we should think of humor as a social practice, a means for collectively acknowledging socially significant incongruities in a way that preserves important social bonds. So it can be used for pro-social and antisocial ends. And you can think of that as the jester. The jester is someone who is able to use humor to convey to the king what other people couldn't or would not, right? Because then you would open yourself up to sanctioning, you know, by the king, death, dishonor, or expulsion. And similarly, it would be bad to shame the king, publicly shame the king, given the king's social status and authority. So the jester, you know, used humor as a skill to both preserve the king's authority sort of publicly and convey to the king what you couldn't just clearly state or assert. And I think you might be able to see, moving to the second part, that inferentialism seems to be particularly well suited for exploring humor, in part because inferentialism already recognizes language use or discursiveness as inherently social and normative. And humor then would be understood as a type of doing, a practice, and importantly related to our social cognitive capacities for tracking others' attitudes. So similarly, something that plays an important role in the inferentialist framework as well. And developmental work has shown that children's sense of humor, toddlers, babies, their sense of humor is related to how they perceive other people's attitudes, their responses and ways in which they behave with regard to humor. And that's, yeah, so here's some more of that. The empirical work on this, which I won't spend too much time on now because I've already been talking too much, but the idea being developmentally humor seems to be related in the same way, or it's related to how we understand ourselves to be subject to other people's attitudes. And perhaps it could be a particularly useful way for us to discern whether a given social interaction is norm governed or not, right? So if I'm angry at what, you know, a particular move you make in an interaction, that signals, there's been a transgression happening. But if I laugh, if I smile, laugh, joke, playfully hit you, then that signals that something else is going on. This is just some more stuff about like how inferentialism would be well suited in terms of we can understand humor as a public social practice. Its meaning is publicly or inferentially articulated, and it's a matter of practical attitudes, right? So how a performance is treated, whether people respond to it through laughter or offense or confusion or sanctioning, right? That will help us pick out what features are important for successful humor. And further, the inferentialist can capture how humor seems to not just be in the business of describing things such that it's appropriate to say, a joke is either true or false. However, we can still be held accountable for our jokes. So that's an important thing we want in a theory of humor. I think philosophical theory of humor is to both capture how you can attempt to be funny and fail, and not just because people don't understand what you're doing. They can understand you tried to be funny and you just weren't successful, versus, just not understanding what you're doing at all. But not the lack of laughter or the absence of laughter doesn't necessarily signal that the joke is a failure. It could be a mismatch between the audience and the joke, the content of the joke. So there's important discursiveness going on there, but it's not clear, exactly how we're supposed to understand sort of the normative entitlements and commitments associated with joke telling, practices of joke telling. And importantly, going back to the Wittgenstein quote I talked about in the beginning, there's something special about humor and language that we see in like linguistic and grammatical jokes. And so what's going on there? And that's also related to the fact that you can use humor to, or humor is a mode of presentation in which we can use like otherwise taboo words, prohibited words such as slurs, or stereotypes. And so what's going on there? And again, a lot of the work, existing philosophical work employs representational tools and vocabulary. So it's a matter of like speaker's intention or the reference or the meaning of the expressions involved, which then requires us to specify what all those things are. And then that just invites further philosophical puzzles and problems. And so that's to say, I think a lot I would like to think there could be a lot of interesting and fruitful work done further cashing out, what an inferentialist has to say about humor, particularly these sort of normative dimensions and social dimensions of humor, and how that relates it closer to maybe like moral vocabulary. Okay, here's probably the more interesting aspect for the audience here, which is that I think exploring or at least focusing on humor gives us some evidence for thinking that humor might be operating like a meta vocabulary. So Wittgenstein notes in the PI that he has this list of different language games in one section. And in that he says that telling jokes or making a joke is itself a type of language game. But I think actually our practices of joke telling are markedly different than other language games like questioning or asserting, because joke telling incorporates other language games. So it draws on our existing conceptual tools, such as making an assertion or a question or a threat or a command or a hypothetical, whatever it would be. It draws on those resources and then misuses them in interesting, surprising ways. Novel ways, right? So if you understand, me saying like, I could kill you right now as a joke, right? You're not going to go hide all the knives, right? You don't actually treat me as if, I've literally, or, I've made a threat. I've made like a play threat. So it somehow draws on the resources of making a threat, involved in making a threat, competently making a threat, but it isn't right equal to making a threat in terms of how it's understood as a move in the language game. 2 paints, that's supposed to be 2 points. So you can think of humor as parasitic on our ordinary language games. And then that might also help explain why humor has culturally relative sort of variations, because its material is in many ways the operating language games. and particularly because it plays with the norms that govern those existing language games. So humor might function as a meta vocabulary. And if we think that, then it might in fact be more powerful, expressively powerful for doing certain things, such as challenging harmful stereotypes, which is something that, a lot of work in philosophy of humor and the ethics of humor explores. And Richard Pryor, American comedian Richard Pryor, is well known for using stereotypes and tropes as a way to challenge them and reveal their absurdities. Right, so it's an uncontested feature of humor that it has a peculiar relationship to norms, which also makes it interesting. We can use humor to play with, reveal norms, no sort of point to it. I think Andy Kaufman is a nice example of that. If you're aware of his humor, I couldn't find actually a video of his Mickey Mouse performance, but there's a sense in which it's revealing commitment, it's revealing implicit commitments in our social practices by subverting them, but not in order to really challenge them. We can also use humor to reinforce norms. So mocking laughter in many ways, I think, serves a conservative function. In carnival times, there were groups of adolescent boys who would go around laughing at other people, typically socially powerful men who would marry young women. And cultural studies and anthropologists have argued that what they're doing there is actually very conservative, even though it's in the guise of this sort of carnivalesque activity, where they're reinforcing norms about who should be dating, who should be marrying who, and who is, because rich older men were basically stealing adolescent men's women, so like in competition with each other. So they would use mocking humor to sort of reinforce norms regarding like romantic sexual selection. No. Another way is challenging norms. Again, Lenny Bruce, American 20th century Jewish comedian, he was often arrested for using profanities during his performances, and he would draw on slurs and other types of prohibited or obscene language. He wouldn't use them according to their typical use, but he would use them in order to draw out their absurdities. And then we can also use humor to refute absolute authority. So challenge otherwise universal meanings, such as what is associated with death, the finality of death, violence, horrific things that might happen, and also God's commands. So again, there's interesting work on the relationship between humor and divine authority. But that's just to say, there's weird stuff going on with humor and norms. So we should think of it maybe as a meta vocabulary, where humor reveals implicit inferential commitments in our operative language games. And this is, I think, again, particularly salient in the case of grammatical jokes. So Mitch Hedberg, he misuses language. He makes an grammatically ungrammatical move, right? By saying, an escalator doesn't break down, it becomes stairs. And we understand something there, but it's not as if he's aiming to really make a metaphysical argument. So humor seems to mess with the rules, and in doing that allows us to acknowledge, in some sense, inferential commitments. And we can then change them, modify them, intervene in them, what have you, now that we've recognized them. And I think it might be particularly powerful because humor has no restriction. There is no, there's no topic on which humor can't consume, or we can't use it to joke about it. It's risky, it could be risky to joke about it, but you can make jokes about basically anything. The only limit is other people's attitudes. And so it has, I think, an expressive power that other vocabularies like assertion or modality or morality do not. But I think it probably, or in that case, it also lacks powers relative to those other vocabularies, which might place humor as a meta vocabulary maybe closer to philosophy or poetry. And it's well known that jokes cannot be explained, so it's not just reducible to reason-based explanation or justification. And laughter is importantly communal or collective, but it's also coercive. People don't always control whether or not they laugh, and they might not even agree that they should be laughing, even though they are laughing with something. And so there's a strange sort of sense in which humor is communal or collective, but the audience is not fully intentionally taking part in it. So that's kind of an interesting part of it too. But that's just to say, I think we can understand humor from within the inferentialist framework as one way we negotiate norms and commitments and entitlements. And it might be particularly good in certain contexts and environments. And that's in hostile social worlds, so contexts in which we are subject to hostile attitudes, particularly, as sort of a constitutive feature of being a member of a community. So a lot of work has been done on how humor flourishes in hostile social environments. So this is what Freud referred to as gallows humor. So the type of humor you might see in a hospital or emergency personnel, which to outsiders seems very morbid or bleak, but in fact serves this important communal role in enabling them to express, again, psychological attitudes, repressed attitudes, or sort of deal with what is otherwise a very psychologically demanding job or environment. And then another important one is the role of insult rituals. So this is what was called the dozens in the US. So there are robust practices of ritualistic insults where members of a community trade insults back and forth as a way to signal intimacy in community. So it builds community, it builds culture. It doesn't just signal to express inferiority, right? It does this actually other thing where theorists have posed that what it actually provides or transmits important skills that enable people to recognize, predict, and combat harmful stereotypes. Because the idea is you're going to encounter hostile attitudes from others. You're going to encounter probably stereotypes. So it's best that you are prepared for them. You can challenge them, extinguish them, purport or show that you are invulnerable to them, these various things. And so we have these practices that we've developed that enable us to do that. And so I think, do I want to keep going on that? So yeah, that's just to say, I think humor is a particularly powerful meta vocabulary for challenging these social norms in the case of stereotypes specifically. Again, because assertions or claims are going to be a lot harder, a lot riskier, and come with sanctions and risks and whatnot. And so, and at least making explicit, Brandom suggests that what we should do if we disagree or we, in some sense, object to the material inferences associated with a given concept or term is not use it. And I think that humor gives us an alternative method or approach, which is to use humor to use stereotypes to reveal their absurdities or incongruities or logical inconsistencies or incoherencies. And that's what many theorists who work on humor using stereotypes to extinguish them have said, right? Where what's going on is not when Richard Pryor uses a racial stereotype, a racist stereotype, or a slur, he's not endorsing it. He's actually misusing it, so to speak, according to its normal, everyday sort of racist grammar, I guess, to reveal its incoherencies. That using this concept commits one to, incompatible attitudes, right, or practices, or what have you, consequences. And then you can think of humor as causing changes in practical attitudes about what inferences should be appropriate. So this helps support some views that deliberation isn't just merely giving reasons and evidence back and forth. It's not always a matter of somebody lacking the relevant evidence. It's a matter of them not seeing it in the right way or understanding it in the right way, or maybe feeling the right way about it. So yeah, I think I've already just been saying this. We have good reason, I think, to approach humor as a type of meta vocabulary that builds on our existing language games and enables us to reveal, acknowledge, challenge, or reinforce inferential commitments associated from our first order practices. And then on that end, I conclude with sort of suggesting how humor might be particularly politically salient in light of this notion of its role as a meta vocabulary, where Rorty's version of pragmatism, which is I think inferentialist in essence, places a significance or importance on sentiment and feeling. And he, in his recent essay on anti-authoritarianism, he notes that the space of reasons is sort of insulated, self-justifying and insulated, in that you have to use you can understand the space of reasons as instituted by justificatory practices, but you can't use the reasons within a practice to challenge the practice itself, because right, the reasons get going within a working language game or social practice. So Rorty suggests, that politically transformative work involves misusing language. His example is feminism and the invention of the term sexual harassment. But the idea is you can misuse language to cause people to feel differently or to be confused and reconsider their assumptions about their behaviors or what have you, but you're not really giving them reasons or justifying why it's true that like sexual harassment is bad. What you want is to get them to see or feel differently about certain behaviors than they did before. So Rorty places an emphasis on sentiment as enabling us to work outside the space of reasons in the space of causes, and in doing so expand or contract or change the space of reasons itself. So what moves we understand or recognize as appropriate. And in that way, I think humor should be understood as continuous with poetry and literature in terms of enabling us to express controversial or revolutionary insights or attitudes. As Rorty says, literature is a safer medium for acknowledging the contingency of authority. And, as that's not to say humor, right? Humor is risky, and it still comes with the risk of misunderstanding and social ostracism and sanctioning, and maybe only certain people can do it successfully. But I think just to conclude, inferentialism is well suited to explain a lot of the important features of humor and its plurality, its diversity, and its normativity, also its social and developmental aspects. And then understanding it as a meta vocabulary gives us reason to look further into like the finer nature of social statuses. So maybe a more or a less idealized way of approaching many questions about inferentialism in the game of giving and asking for reasons, where we can maybe explore how humor and laughter can function in ways as like challenging our commitments, challenging social norms, operating in some sense as a type of like deliberation, although again, not reducible to reasons itself. Okay, I think I kind of went everywhere with that, but thank you for listening to what's a project that's still in many ways under development. So I welcome all comments, questions, criticisms, and concerns. So thank you.
Okay, so now we can open the discussion. We can start with Jaco on the Zoom.
Okay, thank you. That was very stimulating. My question concerns your use of the term meta vocabulary, which you said you somehow get from Brandom. So my worry is that, strictly speaking, it's problematic to call humor a meta vocabulary because it's questionable whether it is a vocabulary to begin with. That is to say, there is no because Brandom, as you know, has this very technically rigorous definition for what is a meta vocabulary. And in case of logic, for example, there is already a clear set of term types that are supposed to be the logical vocabulary. But it seems that in case of humor, there's just is no specifically humorous vocabulary. There's vocabularies and humor operates in them. So that then leads to the question of, is humor itself discursive, or is it just in mixed with discursive practices in a complicated way? But I think that you are right that it's useful and interesting to view humor as disclosive or expressive in some sense. But I would hesitate to say that it is literally a meta vocabulary, at least in Brandom's sense.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I agree. And that's in part something I'm still working on and working out. Another way I was thinking of it is as metalinguistic. So you can think of it as, in some sense, it's using terms, not merely mentioning them, in order to draw out commitments or convey certain commitments or points or something about our social norms or our social reality. in the way that like Amy Thomason suggests, certain debates in metaphysics and philosophy or metalinguistic negotiations. So we're like using terms to argue for how we should use them. So I was thinking, or I'm thinking, humor is a way in which we use, it's a mode of presentation. It's a way in which we use terms, we use conceptual tools to recognize or reveal something about inferential commitments. So I guess that's where I'm seeing it as being something more like a meta vocabulary, is because it has this role in somehow making salient inferential commitments, like consider again the grammatical jokes point, like but I agree. I don't know exactly what's going on, but I'm just like, I feel like something is going on there that is like allowing us to get distance on what we're doing when we're using these concepts or these tools, typically, in the everyday contexts, such that we get a different perspective on them, even if it's not fully like making explicit the proprietaries of use, for a target vocabulary or something like that. But it's like, it gives us bigger picture of the proprietaries of use. I don't know. Yeah, I agree. It's not, I don't mean to say it specifically in the way Brandom uses it, but maybe it should be. And if we consider it that way, we should think more about meta vocabularies themselves, and if they need to be this like very formalized method, I guess. Yeah, I guess that's part of my thing too, of like adding more Rorty into the Brandomian inferentialism, where it's a little messier and a little more like art versus logic. So yeah, but no, yeah, thank you.
Okay, we have a question in the audience.
Hi, thanks so much for that talk. I really enjoyed that. So I just had a question about sort of the way in which humor is like a success term, or has these, like it can be good or bad, and the definition that you gave, and Lenny Bruce. So when you first, the account that you gave after you went through the survey of classical characterizations of humor had this, this notion, and it came up again at the end as well, of, we can reveal these kinds of like incongruities in our presuppositions, or like tensions between our norms in a way that doesn't disturb kind of social. And so, I mean, I remember when I heard that, I thought, oh, like, but, Lenny Bruce, super disruptive to social relations, breaking and getting arrested all the time. And I worry that on The View, if he was able to tell those jokes, but not be so disruptive as to get arrested, it would be more successful humor on that view. But I don't know if that, I would agree with that result. So I was wondering if there's a way your view can, maybe you welcome that result, or maybe you don't think it's committed to having that result. But yeah, that was my question.
No, yeah, thank you. That's also just like the weak, secondly, another weak aspect of the account in terms of, I did want to, if you asked me the same question a week ago, I'd be like, yes, I am committed to it being, having this sort of pro-social role where it's preserving important social bonds and relationships. But yeah, now I don't want to hold that, because it does seem important that, and this I think is true for the mocking humor as well, where it's antisocial elements seem to be essential to it. And yeah, and for Lenny Bruce, his success depends on people being offended and upset by what he's doing, getting them to then reconsider why I guess they find it so offensive. And so if he wasn't arrested, he would be more successful. Yeah. So that's just to say, I think something social is going on, although I don't want to say success depends on preserving social bonds, but then I kind of do. Yeah. Sorry, that's not a very good response to your question. I agree with you that it doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like the right conclusion, although I don't have a better way of capturing what I'm trying to get at with it. Again, looking at like the jester role. But I think a lot of people find the jester role to be markedly different than Lenny Bruce, where there is like the jester sort of promotes or acknowledges the social system, like helps perpetuate it, versus, really deeply challenging it in the way that Lenny Bruce did, such that, he really lost his life, I think, in part because of it. So maybe that, yeah, you're just pushing at sort of the limits of controversial humor as well. So yeah, I think you can use humor in ways that aren't pro-social. And I agree with you. I don't want that to mean to be a mark against its successfulness. But I guess I just need to think more about exactly how I want to specify humor, the social role of humor and its benefits. But I do think like if I give a developmental account, it's like the best way of using humor is in some sense to preserve important social bonds. And that helps explain like why we've kept it around and why it's seen in all these different cultures and times. But yeah, I don't know exactly how to do that.
Thanks. Super interesting.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Maybe we have a time for the last one, a short question. If not, then I would like to thank you again for your talk.